Welcome to Third Floor Views, a production of Chesapeake Family Life, where we talk about health, education, and living with kids. I'm your host, Laura Boycourt. Today, we'll be talking about caregiving, hospice, and how families can navigate losing a loved one. Joining us are writer and author Nancy Taylor Robson and Sue Collins, who's been a nurse for 40 years, 25 of which she spent with Gilchrist Hospice Center in Towson. Thank you both so much for being here today.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you.
Absolutely. And I think we should preface this with just sort of saying that, yes, this is an incredibly difficult, conversation and topic, but it's so important, so worthwhile to have because readers and listeners, no matter what age they are, no matter what age their loved ones in their family, this eventually will apply to nearly all of us. This is something that absolutely has to be talked about. So thank you for taking the time to do it. So I'd love to start with your backgrounds. What have your personal and professional experiences been with caregiving and or hospice? Nancy, if you could start.
I have no professional background with it at all. It's all the caregiving I've ever done. My father, when he was leaving, my mother-in-law, and actually friends, has just been because I'm a friend or because I'm a relative, and that's who you are and it's what you do. But it's an incredibly poignant and important time in my view, and it's worth doing. It's something not to be afraid of, but it's difficult. There's no question.
Sure, absolutely. Sue, what about you? Could you tell us about your background?
Yeah, so I've actually been a nurse. I looked at it's been a little longer because it's 2023, so it's like 49 years.
Oh my goodness.
and,
Wow.
and 38 in hospice. But here's the thing, for me with hospice. I've always enjoyed bedside nursing, and hospice has afforded me the time to spend with families where I think in the hospital it's so hurried. There's so many things that need to be done. Hospice gives me a time to kind of slow down and really listen to patients and their caregivers.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Great. And so you've both written a book together. It is called Okay, Now What? A Caregiver's Guide to What Matters. I personally got a lot from this book. It meant a lot to me as someone, who has lost loved ones and saw other loved ones in that caregiving role. What inspired you to write this book, Nancy?
We were introduced by a mutual friend a number of years ago, and we sat down and had lunch, and it was as though it was the right time and the right two people. My dad had died, and I had walked through it with him, and my brother, he and I did tag team. Fortunately, my mother-in-law, my stepmother rather, was no stranger to strong drink. So it meant that we were on deck more than we might have been, but that was fine. We worked as a team pretty well. And Sue and I got to just telling stories. And that's a part of what we put in the book. We wanted to be sure to put the stories of, different experiences to go through and how different people go through this. So, Sue, you were saying yesterday that we came away with chapter headings.
Yeah. When we left the restaurant, we pretty much had the chapter titles for the book, which I thought was pretty incredible and kind of telling. I think the other driving force for me, and it's still relevant in the work I do today, is that I wanted the book to provide answers for the questions caregivers do not know to ask. And we wanted to design the book so that it would be such that a person could have a particular situation and go and look for it in the book without having to read the whole thing. They could find that part, get the tips, get the resources, and feel supported.
And to your credit, both of you, it's taking such a a sad yet sort of inevitable part of life, obviously, and you were able to turn it into such a great, worthwhile resource for people because, like you said, they don't necessarily know what to expect. You're answering all of these questions for readers who don't know that they really needed that answer. So it's something so useful and important came out of such a sad time of life. But let's get into caregiving and how it impacts family dynamics and life. And we can use sort of your book chronologically as a guide. let's address first how to talk to children about a loved one's illness or the fact that they're dying. This is such a sensitive area, whether, it's a preschool kiddo or a teenager, they're all going to react in different ways. And it's also important. So what's your best advice? And before I get into your respective answers, I'm pulling one quote from your book that really stuck with me, is that some children want and need to be protected until they can't be protected any longer. Others need to be included. It's a soup to nut mix. Whether or not to tell a child depends on a host of factors, including the personalities involved, the ages of the children, and the circumstances. So Sue, maybe you want to begin just by telling us from your experience how it's best to sort of, field this in terms of young kids or old kids, I guess.
One thing I say often to parents, particularly of younger children, is that you don't want that child to grow up and say, I'll never forgive you for perhaps not allowing me to see the person, not allowing, you know what I mean, to protect. And as parents, I think we have this innate feeling to protect, and children want to talk about it. So I think, it depends on age of the child. But I think giving them the opportunity to maybe talk about, express their feelings, say, look, today we're going to go see grandma. She's going to look a little different. And if the child decides once they get to the house, I don't think I want to do this, then you support that too, because they may change their mind and they may not. But I think in the book, as Nancy and I have discussed many times, one of the she was actually a patient, it was a mother and a son, and the mother was the one with the illness, and the young son, she had 3 boys, the youngest one was really suffering the most. And so she sat down with him and they wrote a book together. So she wrote a page about what was going on, and then he wrote a page about his feelings about what was going on. And one of the things that triggered this for her was that he thought it was contagious and that he was going to get it. And that's very common, for a young child. So then, they wrote this book together, and then Nancy, tell her that what happened when you called Ben later on.
Well, it's interesting because Ben he was like 14 when they wrote the book, and they went around and they did various talks and things because of this, and because and she was, connected in Baltimore in a way that it was very helpful to a lot of different groups of people. But then when we were writing this, he's a grown man now, and I called him just to make sure that he wouldn't have a problem with my quoting him in the book. And he said, I really don't want to talk about it anymore. I've been there. I went through that whole thing. I was saturated and I'm done.
Right.
Fair enough. He was like 27 when I talked to him. So we all go through different stages, it's with my kids, when my father was dying, they were like 8 and 10. And I said, here's the deal. It was 3 years, and he was mostly very active until the very end. But he was at home, and I would go down every other day, as it was so easy because you're working and you're taking care of kids and stuff. But anyway, I had said to both of them, if you're home, I can take you with me or not take you. I'll figure something else out. Just let me know. And my daughter early on said, I don't want to. She was the younger one. So fine. And then my son kept coming and just basically to support me. He wouldn't come in to see Pop, but he was there with me, drive down. He'd be in the living room reading books, and then he'd get back in the car with me and go home. And then finally he said, I can't do it either. Okay.
Yeah. So it sounds like sort of honoring, their taking the cue from them, honoring, what their comfort level is, and being open with them at the same time, giving them the information, not too much, but leaving it up to them. So not keeping it the secret that they're completely cut off from, but.
Right. And listening to what, sort of watching and listening to what their cues to you are too.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
All
right, let's move into the practical. And again, this part of it is sort of more for the adults, the grown-up children. But can you talk to me about the finances, the paperwork, physical locations, and considerations? There's so much that goes into this once you have a loved one who's nearing the end. Nancy, what has your experience been? What's your advice for all of those things? I know that's a lot a lot of
Well,
ground to
actually,
cover.
it's pretty, I can give you pretty succinct advice about this, and that is
Sure.
get all the paperwork in order first. And
Yep.
it's something that, because, we might be hit by a bus and you're not prepared for it. My mother died
Mhm.
very, very suddenly, but the paperwork was already in order.
Okay.
And so if you've got a will, if you've got a power, general power of attorney, which incidentally dies with a person, if you've got all of the necessary paper for the state in which you live, and there are websites you can go to, and there are website links in the book. It'll streamline things so much, because you're going to have enough to work with, but just keep it in a place where everybody knows and know who's in charge and what the paperwork says. And then it'll save fights. It'll save scrambling around at the last minute. And at least those kinds of things will let you do the nuts and bolts and the logistical stuff in a way that allows you to really still be present with the person that you love, that you're walking through this with.
Sure, absolutely. Sue, any additional advice or consideration?
Well, yes, in talking with Nancy, I think it's really key, particularly in the work that I do. We have a little segment later on in the book about there may be dragons, and there are some in some families. And so one way to kind of avoid a lot of, anxiety and issues surrounding that is to have the paperwork in order. If you do not have, say, an advance directive, any hospital will help you put one together right there. So if a person is in the hospital and having some issues, very often they will do an advance directive right then and there and appoint somebody to at least be, they can only do the medical power of attorney, certainly not the financial part.
Okay. And then when this sort of journey, so to speak, is beginning, for caregivers, for family members, the people who are really close to this loved one who is dying, what does self-care look like? We know it's so important for the caregivers, the ones in that nuclear family, to really take care of themselves. So what should parents, children's caregivers keep in mind as they're about to embark on this experience of caring for, living with, spending time with someone? Sue?
I think to try and maintain some normalcy in your life. So for instance, if you belong to, as Nancy and I were kind of chuckling a little bit yesterday, to a pickleball or bocce group, there seems to be the current sport. I mean, try to get that in, try to at least maybe go out once a week just for yourself, just to give yourself an opportunity to be with other folks, to be out of the house. I think that's really very key. I think the other thing is exercise, because it really helps, with depression, the dopamine. And exercise can be as simple as, I was telling Nancy that my mother, when she could not get to the senior center, usually because of weather, she would go up and down the stairs in her house. She would just do stair climbing and, in her 80s and climb the stairs, and thought, okay, well, I did this 15 times. I'm good for the day.
Yeah. Well, it all makes a difference.
It does make a difference,
Yeah, sure.
So I think those are really key.
Great advice. Nancy, what would you recommend?
Well, for me, I need to be outdoors every day. I don't care what the weather is. And I go out and weed the beans, or, sit in the greenhouse, or just sit outside I knit myself during the pandemic. I knit myself a pair of fingerless gloves. So I would put on my down coat and go and sit outside with a book, just to be outdoors. That piece for me is, and you get a little meditative time and you breathe deeply and you think, okay, look, nature goes on. This is the way it all works. We're all, stardust. All of that. I think it really does help to sort of calm you down, but it's also very therapeutic for you.
Fantastic advice. So sort of caregiving 101, if we're into sort of the nuts and bolts of it, for those older family members, things that they're going to need to do probably on a daily basis. Could you talk to us, first Nancy and then Sue, maybe a little bit about the things to consider, medications, necessary items that might be needed? What are some of those things that you've seen time and time again, or in your personal experiences, that caregivers really need to sort of consider?
Well, in terms of the medication, that's more Sue's bailiwick, although I do know, have from experience, that different medications really respond to different human beings. I mean, my
Mm,
father, for example, was on one that, a lot of people I've heard had steroid that people have trouble with, and he's like, it just makes me pee more. But he continued to
yeah,
sail
yeah.
until, within weeks of when he actually was bedridden and left.
Mhm,
And from our family, it was just the two of us, my brother and myself, and that's sort of his end of things. He would go to the doctor's appointments with my dad,
mhm,
because his our stepmother was really not tracking well. So he would
mhm.
go to, and he would listen to everything and get, ask the questions that they might not have thought of and write things down. And he took care of that piece, and mine was the financial side of things.
Okay, so it sounds like there's a lot to juggle, and I'm glad you
There
brought
is.
that up, that having that other person there at the appointment, and maybe they have to be there anyway, but really having another set of ears to really get all that information in, because if something kind of went under the radar or was forgotten or misunderstood, that can make a big difference. So that's really important, I'm sure.
It made a huge difference. In fact, I've got a friend that just died last fall, and they were in their 80s. They are in their 80s, and his wife was not 100% anymore. And so
Mhm,
one of his sons fortunately lives close enough that I suggested that he go every time. And it
mhm,
really did make
mhm.
a huge difference, because then, what she was reporting and what the son was reporting were not necessarily the same thing.
Right, right. Very important. Stu, what have you found in your experience in terms of the sort of the nuts and bolts medication, et cetera?
Well, I think the more prepared you are, the better. So if you get even, at the dollar store, one of those little strips that have the days of the week on it, and you put the
Mhm,
medicines in it, and or even an egg carton. You don't even need to go that fancy. You can make your own and have like two rows, morning, night, and something like
mhm,
that. That's one thing. But the other thing I think that is key, if you're going to have other family members coming and going and helping you, is to have a logbook handy somewhere. Usually I recommend the kitchen, because everybody gravitates to the kitchen, of if you had to give a medicine, say for pain, that's not normally given, that you would write down what time you gave it, so that the person who is maybe coming in for a couple hours to relieve you for that bocce ball game,
mhm.
then they know that if the person is having pain, when that last dose was, so I
Super,
think that
super
that
helpful,
helps.
right?
Yeah.
Right, absolutely. And then we visited this already in a way, but again, caring for the caregiver. How important is it for a caregiver to ask for help, and what type of support should they be seeking? And I know in your book, which is fantastic, that you offer resources. I think actually hardcover, your physical books, websites where caregivers can get some questions answered, find some support. So what would you recommend on that front? Sue?
Well, I think one thing that we were talking about yesterday was journaling. And
Mm,
we had, I think if a person, as far as asking for things, but also sometimes, again, you don't know what you need.
mhm.
You're so
Yeah.
overwhelmed and so caught up in the day to day that you don't even take the breath to pause to see what you need. So if you journal, we had one, and it was in the book, story of a friend who was journaling, and he started off making lists. I've got to do this, I've got to do that, and then it started getting deeper and deeper, and he realized, I can start saying things to this on paper that I don't have to discuss with anybody
Mhm,
else.
mhm.
Um, and he got a lot out of that, you
Yeah.
know. And I think the
Mhm.
nice thing about doing something like that is that maybe a year or so after, the person has passed and you're really feeling down and you look back on that journal, you can go, I really have made some progress, even if you're having a bad day.
Yeah.
Sure, sure. Nancy, what do you think?
I agree. I did a lot of writing while I write professionally, but my
Yeah.
I did a lot of essays and stuff also, while my father in particular, but my mother-in-law too, was leaving, and being able to just get it out of your chest and onto a piece of paper. And then you can, in a way, you can sort of take control of it, manipulate it in the way that you think, okay, let me see what I've written. Do I really believe that? Is this really
Mhm.
how I feel? Or suddenly it's like, oh, look what I wrote. I really feel that way.
Mhm.
And I think that's it's cathartic in a way, really.
Mhm.
Sure. A little bit of therapy, and maybe it kind of helps you see things, when you, like, to Sue's point, you can go back and kind of look at things and say, well, is this something I need to address? Or, yeah, the progress piece I think is really
Yeah,
important.
it's that, and it's
Mhm.
also, you haven't sort of overshared with a neighbor or friend, and you think, oh, I really shouldn't have said that.
Right.
Like, I mean, you might feel like, God, I can't wait till this is over. And you get
Yeah.
to see that without somebody looking at you like, you're not going to use the therapeutic pillow, are you? I mean, what's the,
Right, the judging. Yeah, yeah,
Right.
yeah.
absolutely. Yep. So let's talk a little bit about hospice. Sue, I'd like to start with you, since
Mhm.
this is sort of your wheelhouse. What is hospice, specifically for listeners and viewers that might have sort of an idea, but not of the particulars? And when is it time to consider hospice?
So hospice is really end of life care. And Medicare regulations say that a physician has to certify in writing that they think you have 6 months or less. Um, and if they're wrong, great. So it used to be that Medicare only offered 7 months of hospice care when I started this in the 80s, and now it's unlimited because they realized
Okay.
you can't
You're not
standardize it.
sure. Yeah,
You
yeah,
can't
right.
standardize it.
Mhm.
One thing I think is really key that I still talk about today with families, um, I think there's a lot of hesitancy to think about hospice because a caregiver, if they're speaking on behalf of someone who can't speak for themselves, they feel like they're letting them down.
Mm.
They are, giving up too soon. And I always, always, always point out to them, it's not definite. I mean, you can sign up for hospice and then tomorrow you can revoke, or
Mhm.
next week you can revoke. So it's not permanent. It's
Mhm.
really, I tell every patient and family, you're in the driver's seat. You chose this because you're saying, okay, the doctor says there's no more curative care and I'm ready just to go for hospice and comfort care. But you know what? I'm feeling a lot better now. Maybe I'm going to think about that treatment. And then you sign
Mhm.
one piece of paper and go for it.
Mhm. And
So I
that's so
think that's
important to keep
key.
in mind. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Nancy, what were you gonna say?
Well, I was going to say my mother-in-law did that. In fact, she had hospice in about a year and a half before she died. And then she's like, I really don't need this. And she dismissed them. And
Mm.
she ended up having hospice just for the last several weeks. And it was so helpful to her. She was a very definite human being.
Mhm.
And at one point, the hospice worker came in with morphine and was explaining, how to use morphine to her and to my husband and myself. And she said, "So are you in pain?" And she said, "No, I'm not." And the hospice worker said, "So are you afraid?" She goes, "Should I be?" And I thought, it's just, I
Right.
thought,
Yeah.
yep, that's her.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it sounds like, for example, just a personal thing. One of my brothers-in-law somewhat recently, this past winter, spring, no, fall. My calendar's all messed up. He passed away from cancer, and he was on hospice, and it was a very, very aggressive form of cancer. And so for him, there was never going to be that option, of seeking treatment down the line. For him, it seemed like it was absolutely the right decision. It eased the pain. It made, that final, 6 to 8 weeks, it was what he needed. But it's comforting also to know that, yes, that can provide comfort, but then also the fact that it's sort of not one size fits all, that you can revoke it,
Right.
like you were saying, Sue. So I think that's really important to know for people that it really does depend on the case and the situation.
Right.
And also help having the ability to ease pain if that's what they're
Yep.
suffering, those kinds of
Mhm.
things. Enormous quality of life issue and enormous
Yeah,
quality of life for all the people who are around you and love you too.
absolutely. That's so
Mhm.
important to add. So let's talk about dying when things are nearing the end and it's the final days, or at least seems like them. Nancy, what advice would you offer families when a loved one is in those final days? And again, this isn't one size fits all, but in your experience, what you've gleaned from going through this, what could you offer?
Keep remembering to breathe. I mean, I'm serious about it. It's just you catch yourself and you realize that you've been sort of half holding your breath the whole time and you think,
Mm-hmm.
just realize that you need to keep breathing, but it does make a difference. It helps to calm you down. But also, I said this to a friend of mine who was walking through her father. I said, you're never going to feel more truly connected with the life that we live here than right now, because it's a real wake-up call about all of this is on borrowed time. Take every little bit of joy, not just pleasure and not just happiness, but joy out of everything that you see that is joyful, and be grateful for it, because it makes an enormous difference in how the experience for everyone involved goes. I was with my dad when he died, and I was really glad I was.
No, yeah, no, I'm sure. Sue, what about you?
Well, when I started hospice, I started at Stella Maris, which is a Catholic facility in Baltimore County. And when we were starting, one of the nuns, one of the sisters, made a really strong point that to families, and also taught us that when you're sitting on those final days, never put your hand on top of theirs, because it makes them feel like you're holding them down. Slip your hand underneath, and that you're making contact, but you're not holding them down. Which I found really powerful, and a lot of family members did. And I think also, in the case of, say, my uncle, I had a cousin who, really was struggling and having some issues. And my uncle was kind of lingering. And so when my other cousin, the brother, came in, he happened to be at Gilchrist. And I said to him, I said, Chris, why don't you tell him that you'll make sure she's okay? Not that you're going to promise. And I said, don't lie, because, he'll see right through it. But I said, but just tell him that you'll make sure that she's okay. And he died 45 minutes after that conversation.
Oh my goodness.
So it's
Wow.
like sometimes they're hanging on for something. So if there's something that might be troubling them, or in this case, another family member, or if they've been caring for a family member or a disabled person and they were the primary caregiver, whatever the situation is, the family, the situation, just be honest with them.
Okay.
It's
Great
helpful.
advice. Yeah. So after a loved one has passed, what is that like for families and children and teens especially? I know that a lot of our listeners and viewers, have those kids in the household. So what is that like when a loved one has passed for them? What can help them in such a difficult time? Sue, do you want to start?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I'm having a flashback of a family I went to see. It was the mother of a young child. He had the night before curled up in bed with his mother. And then when I got there, because they called me after it happened and I went there, he's now playing on the floor in the living room. Everybody else around him is crying and upset. And he's like, okay, back to the toys, and I don't think in this case it wasn't any kind of denial. I mean, he clearly spent time with his mother, but he was young, and I think it depends on the child. So he just kind of went right back to his life.
His life, yeah.
His life.
Yeah.
And I think it depends. I think it depends on the age of the child. I just think it depends on the relationship they had with the person. There's a lot of factors. But again, in talking with them in the beginning and being on top of things and being open with them to continue that conversation and allow them, if a person is in hospice, most all hospices offer bereavement, and they offer specific bereavement for children. So I think that's helpful too.
Sure. Nancy, what's your experience and advice?
Well, I think a lot of, if you have been sort of straightforward with the kids and talked with them all along, they'll know. I mean, depending upon their age, but they'll know that either my mom is not with us anymore, and why is that? And you may have to keep explaining about it, but you just keep going on and doing everything that you normally do. They go to school, they do the homework, you read books with them or to them. And maybe something will trigger, like, oh, do you remember how Pop used to say this? And you bring all those memories into it without making it, and it's helpful if the parent is not so bereaved that they're crying in front of the kids all the time.
No, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Well, as we wrap things up, any parting words of comfort or advice, anything that we haven't really addressed? I feel like we've absolutely addressed a lot of it, but anything else that you'd like to add, advice for families, Nancy?
Well, can I say actually something about the book itself, just because
Sure, of course you can.
we worked really hard to give this, that make it a very practical kind of a manual, and also in a lot of stories in there. And Sue and I have a slightly Black sense of humor. So, I mean, and Marion Grant, who is the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health Policy Fellows, blurbed it, one of the people who blurbed it, and she said, written with a practical and light touch. Some sections made me smile, and the humor makes difficult topics more bearable. And that's, it's a great, it's exactly what we were hoping for.
No, absolutely. And I think that's so important to sort of have that levity, with when it comes to such difficult content.
Yeah.
What about you, Sue?
I don't really have anything to add to that. I think it's like we were talking yesterday. After all said and done, go out and have some ice cream. Go do
Yeah.
something, go do something that makes you happy.
Yes.
And you might have to push yourself for that, because you don't want to live in that, oh, I shouldn't, or feel guilty. Everybody needs a little bit of a push to continue the bocce ball game.
That's right.
I love that. I love that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much to both
Thank
Nancy
you.
Taylor Robson. Oh, absolutely.
you.
And Sue Collins for taking the time to speak with us about caregiving and how families can find their way through such a difficult time. And thank you to all of our viewers and listeners as well. Make sure you visit ChesapeakeFamily.com for up-to-date local information on home, health, and living for today's Maryland parent. This episode will be archived on ChesapeakeFamily.com in video and podcast format. I'm Laura Boycourt with Chesapeake Family Life and Third Floor Views. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.